Welcome everyone here and online. I'd like to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging that the University of Sydney's Camperdown campus, where the Sydney Environment Institute is located, is on the unceded, meaning stolen lands, of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Colonization has devastated Indigenous communities in multiple ways, including the damage done to country and the relationships, ties, meanings, and ceremony between and across human and non-human lives. And that damage is only accelerating due to climate change. Voice, truth-telling, entreaty, straightforward requests of the Uluru Statement are crucial steps towards reparation and restoration of Indigenous communities, relations with settlers, and relations with country. That'll be part of the process of acting on and institutionalizing the respect for the knowledges held by elders past and present that we often recognize and don't act upon. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon for Dr. Blanche Verlie's talk on feeling climate injustice. I'm David Schlosberg. I'm the director of the Sydney Environment Institute and professor of environmental politics here at the University of Sydney. I had the pleasure of hiring Blanche 3 years ago as an SEI postdoctoral fellow in environmental humanities, and have been working and thinking and writing with her and others over the last 3 years. For those that don't know Blanche, she is a multidisciplinary social scientist whose work focuses on climate change and how we might act differently and better. Blanche draws on feminist and multi-species philosophies to consider the complex, diverse, and intimate ways that climate changes manifest in contemporary life, and how this analysis could inform more just and ecological modes of living in and with and as the world. Blanche's work focuses specifically on the ways climate change is felt and lived and imagined, such as the often visceral experiences of climate distress and the unequal and unjust dimensions of this, as well as how this affective injustice can inspire regenerative forms of climate action. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Blanche is also the author of Learning to Live with Climate Change, From Anxiety to Transformation, which was published by Routledge last year. Get your copy. Look, one of the missions of SEI is to work with early career researchers, to help them find some community at the university, to bring them into academic networks, to writing projects, to grants, and more. And we've had a number of postdoctoral fellows in SEI over the years, some funded by the university, some by external grants. And it's been an experience. And of course, what happens is we say that we're here to make community for our ECRs, but of course they themselves create community for all of us, create networks, they create support systems for other ECRs, and frankly for our late career researchers as well. Nobody ever uses that phrase, late career researcher, but there are a few of us around. Blanche has had an immeasurable impact on SEI in this respect. She has had an impact on many of our communities of scholars and on our own thinking at SEI about a range of issues and projects that we address. So just an example on building community, Blanche started with us all of, like 3 months before the pandemic hit. And the lockdown hit, and we were all at home. And for anyone that knows SEI has been involved with us, you know that our methodology is in-person engaged, right? Everything starts in a workshop where people are talking across a table. So COVID just shut down our methodology. And then it put us at home as well. And our own workplace is a collaborative space. It's open, and there's always something happening and something being invented in that space. And of course, we weren't there. And of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was tough and folks were a bit devastated, but Blanche was really the first one that stood up and said, let's use this Zoom thing a bit more, and started with just some check-ins for folks, which was just really important, no pressure, just folks actually talking to one another, and then organized the first time we'd done Zoom seminars, online seminars, just for people to present their research while they were in isolation. And that program has just been a huge hit, and it's been incredible, and people have been coming now for nearly 3 years to this thing that Blanche started for us, which is just fantastic. As we started, we tried to do lunchtime seminars early on, and it was just too much for everybody to come to campus. When everybody's locked down, they wanted to see other folks, and that's all just to say thanks for that. By the way, there's one tomorrow at noon with Damien Ricketson. That's an advertisement. Blanche also took on coordination of a new research cluster on climate anxiety and emotions, and she brought together folks from across the university, organizing both internal and externally facing events, another one coming in November. This helped to build not just local communities, but national communities and global communities around her own work, this brilliant book on climate anxiety, and this excellent edited journal on anxiety and youth activism. But it's just been a really important generative way to develop communities on and off campus. So that's all to say that Blanche has just been a great community builder here at SEI, the instigator and the glue really holding together many of our communities of scholars, and for that we're all deeply appreciative. And then there's the scholarship. And I just want to acknowledge here how much I personally have learned from Blanche over the last few years. In particular, her work with us in the Multi-Species Justice Collective and on climate justice, which she'll be discussing today. So I have, in the past, been a little critical of environmental humanities scholars who have used the term multi-species justice without really talking much about what the justice of that means. And Blanche has brought to me this broad, new perspective and substantive approach for understanding justice in contemporary environmental contexts. She's brought together, from the environmental humanities, new materialisms, feminist environmental humanities, broader eco-feminist themes and theories with public health approaches, education approaches, and more to climate and climate anxiety. And she's made our understanding of not just multi-species justice or climate justice, but of justice, our understanding of justice, more material, more visceral, more ecological. That materiality, that bodily nature of injustice, that experience of injustice, has become a way to link the human experience of climate injustice for us with the broader experience of multi-species injustice. And there's one piece in particular, it's this piece in Environmental Politics, which is a special symposium on multi-species justice edited by Christine Winter, on what Blanche calls aspirational climate justice, which was written in the wake of the bushfires. And it understands climate injustice as both an inhibition, I hope I'm not getting to things that you'll say today, an inhibition of our very breath, and we experienced this during the bushfires, the inhibition of our very breath, and a limitation then of our broader aspirations, and it's that combination of the limitation of our breathing and aspirations that is both a brilliant piece for me because it gets at the impacts, it gets at the literally toxic embodiment of climate change, and is an incredible way to theorize, an important way to theorize what we were literally feeling in those months, the actual inhalation of tens of thousands of acres of forests, the inhalation of billions of dead animals. And this was in our space, in our bodies, in our noses, and in Blanche's understanding of what climate injustice was, is, will be. And in doing all of this in her time at SEI, Blanche has been just this incredible example of collegiality and collaboration and networking and productivity and scholarly innovation, everything that we want to be about and that Blanche has brought to us. So she's been an important inspiration and example for our entire community. So it is with deep gratitude and immense respect that we send Blanche off to her new gig, working with our good friend and collaborator Lauren Rickards at our MIT. So we established these postdoctoral fellow lectures as part of the process of saying thanks, and painfully a way of saying goodbye to colleagues who we really don't want to say goodbye to. But it's our way of celebrating the work of our postdocs while asking them to do one more thing. So Blanche is going to give a bit of a talk. We'll have a Q&A for folks watching from home. There is a Slido address that should be in the chat that you can pop your questions in. Vote your questions up, because I'll look at the ones that are at the top of the list. For the folks in the room, we'll have a mic to go around. You raise your hands. I'll go back and forth between the online and the in-person audience. All right, so that's just all to introduce our amazing, but now, unfortunately, former postdoctoral fellow in environmental humanities, our brilliant collaborator and friend, and an important and internationally recognized scholar in environmental humanities and climate justice and climate anxiety, Dr. Blanche Verlie.
Ooh, thank you, David. I think the intro might be the highlight. I'm not sure if the talk's going to live up to that very generous introduction, so thank you. And hi, everyone, both in the room and online. It's so fabulous to be here with you tonight. In order to begin, I'd like to acknowledge that in the room here, we meet on the stolen and unceded country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to pay respects to any Indigenous people here with us today. In doing so, I would like to acknowledge the long-running practices of survivance of Indigenous peoples, practices which include sorry business, humour, multi-species mourning, and unending care for each other and country in the face of continuing colonisation and genocide. These are practices of feeling and resisting climate injustice through care for community and country. It's a huge privilege to speak to you here tonight in recognising that I'm on stolen Gadigal country, where colonisation and environmental injustice are ongoing active processes. I want us to keep in mind important questions about who is afforded opportunities, resources and audiences to consider and discuss climate injustice and who is not, and to recognise that the opportunities I've received are thanks to a lot of unearned privileges. I also wanted to acknowledge that what I'm able to present today is thanks to collaboration and support from a lot of people over a lot of time, from students, supervisors, academic peers, community activists, family, friends, and more. I don't want to list everyone because that will take a long time, and also I will no doubt forget someone and then be anxious about that. So I would just say, please know that your support is deeply appreciated. And I will give a quick shout out to the Sydney Environment Institute as a whole. Directors, researchers, students and professional staff have all helped me immensely throughout the nearly 3 years that I've been at SEI. If it wasn't for the role that I've had here, I would not have had the time, networks, support or resources to do the work that I have done, which is what I'm here to talk about. So thank you, SEI. Finally, a content warning. This talk includes reference to and images of the climate crisis, and perhaps more distressingly, of Scott Morrison and his government and his government's response to climate catastrophe. I realise all of this is distressing and potentially traumatising, but it's hard to talk about it without talking about it. So I am sorry. If you're calling in online, do what you need to do. If you're in the room and need to mentally check out or leave, that's totally fine. If all of this is too much for you to handle alone, and honestly, I think it should be, make sure to reach out to someone. All climate challenges are better addressed together. So tonight I'm talking about feeling climate justice and injustice, which is an effort to connect two often distinct conversations and issues. The first is climate justice, a framework that explains how the impacts of climate change are experienced more severely by those who've contributed least to causing the problem. Climate justice emphasises how unfair this is. It thus considers climate change an inherently political problem, one which is caused by and exacerbates stark inequalities, including gender, racial, income, and other inequalities. As our multi-species justice communities have been articulating here at SEI and beyond, this also includes species inequalities. We only have to look at any climate disaster to see that it is poor people, people of colour, women, rural communities, and the forests, oceans, mountains, animals, plants, and fungi who suffer the worst. The second is the issue of climate anxiety or grief. Research tells us that increasing numbers of people are becoming incredibly emotionally distressed by climate change, often just by thinking about it. In conversations about this, we find a big emphasis on young people, those destined to inherit constantly worsening climatic conditions. According to a recent survey of young people around the world, lead authored by Caroline Hickman, 77% of young people said they consider the future to be frightening, and almost half said that their worry about climate change adversely affects their daily functioning. Climate anxiety is often defined as a chronic fear of environmental doom. I understand it as a sense that your world, your relationships, assumptions, dreams, security, and identity are in the process of ending. This experience might manifest as distinct emotional states, as nightmares or panic attacks, relationship breakdown, general disillusionment, an inability to make plans, and potentially lead to mental illness. To a large extent, however, the issues of climate distress and climate justice have not been considered together. Climate justice scholarship and activism has focused on more tangible, measurable, and rational impacts of climate change, from economics and livelihoods to infrastructure and shelter. Increasingly, intangible impacts are being paid more attention, in part thanks to advocacy from frontline communities around the world, emphasising that climate change is much more than that. It's a loss of connection to ancestors, of cultural continuity, of connection to country or sense of place, of a sense of personal purpose, of community belonging, of personal agency, and of personal identity. Such intangible losses speak more to people's lives and help us see that climate injustice is also about deeply unfair, subjective experiences. Climate justice discussions, however, do not frequently focus on emotions, and at the same time, conversations in climate emotions have not adequately centred a justice lens. Firstly, far too frequently, having feelings about climate change is seen as an individual's problem, which can be measured through psychometric instruments and then treated through mental health services. While counsellors have a lot to offer, and so much of what I've learned on this topic is thanks to the amazing psychologists from groups like Psychology for a Safe Climate, pathologising climate distress enables governments and corporations to blame individuals for not being resilient enough and to limit their liability by simply funding therapy, while at the same time they continue to fund fossil fuels and fail to provide any kind of adequate disaster response. As Ruth Hugger, who lost her home in Coama to the bushfires, recently wrote in The Guardian, feeling supported would dramatically improve our mental health. We're getting mental health counselling because no one will help us. If someone helped us, we wouldn't need as much mental health counselling. Of course, discussions about climate distress do seem to presume that the issue is political and unfair, largely based on the premise that young people are worse affected and that this makes climate anxiety an issue of intergenerational injustice. But this is not often made explicit and it's often poorly articulated. The failure to explicitly analyse climate distress as a political issue, as one of injustice, fails to hold perpetrators of this violence responsible. But it also fails to account for the intersectional differences and the inequalities regarding who experiences climate distress, to what extent and in what ways. Young people themselves are not a homogenous group. An uncritical concern about climate anxiety can perpetuate the racial, economic and gendered inequalities that cause climate change and climate injustice. As Sarah Ray has written, this is why climate anxiety can be perceived to be a white issue that recenters and privileges the feelings and worries of white people. A politics of emotion that repeats the logic of cutting people of colour, like Vanessa Nakate, out of the narratives of youth climate activism. As my colleague Jade Sasser has noted, if we don't know, haven't asked, and don't know how to speak to people of colour from around the world about how they feel about climate change, well, this is systemic racism in action. So if we're to adequately address the cause, not just the symptoms of climate distress, and to ensure we don't perversely recenter whiteness while doing so, we need to think climate justice and climate feelings together. Before I get into talking more about feeling climate injustice, it's worth pausing just to outline one key concept that I use to think this through: affect. Affect is sort of a synonym for feeling, but it goes beyond the idea of emotions. Affect encompasses what we might otherwise separate into physiological and psychological feelings. It also spans other things that we often divide into binaries: mind and body, conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, human and nature. Affect is the forces that, like the weather and the climate, swirl around and through us, ignite certain feelings, sensations, ideas and movements. Affects are composed through the interaction of human and non-human people, places, environments, cultures and politics. I think of climate as an inherently affective phenomenon. For me, thinking climate as a set of affective forces is really important for getting outside the problematic idea that climate distress is a set of feelings someone has about climate change, as though climate change is something external to ourselves. Rather, when we think climate through affect, we realise that core climatic qualities like temperature, atmospheric pressure, and humidity are all affective. The reason we have these concepts and bother measuring them is because these forces affect our bodies, and indeed all kinds of bodies: animal, vegetal, aquatic, geologic, atmospheric. Take these Japanese macaques, for example, for whom bathing in hot springs in the snow brings sensations of physiological and mental bliss, sensations so desirable that the collective establishes rich bathing cultures around them. Indeed, the shape, location, function, and capacities of our bodies are all intensely structured by climatic conditions. That's why we can't live underwater, on the moon, or elsewhere. Take the blobfish, for example. This critter is widely known as the world's ugliest animal. When encountered by humans, however, they're a long way from their climatic home, which is the cold, deep sea. Because of the cold, high-pressure environments, blobfish have evolved such that they have minimal muscles and bones. They don't need them to hold their bodies up because the water pressure does this for them. So in fact, they are not normally so blobby at all. Indeed, when they look blobby, this is due to the fish having experienced massive climatic displacement and thus huge bodily trauma. So what we can take from the so-called blobfish is that climate is a force which fundamentally and dramatically shapes and influences our bodies. From our DNA to our morphology, we are composed by climate. Changes in climate then, for example, moving from the deep sea to the open atmosphere, or from a stable climate on planet Earth to a hotter, more volatile one, will exert myriad affective forces on us. So weather and climate are inherently affective. However, how we're affected by climate is not inevitable or natural. We develop cultural practices regarding our felt experiences of weather and climate. For example, thanks to Britain's drizzle and the colonisation of what we now call Australia by the British, urban Australians often celebrate sunny days and resent the rain, even though it rarely rains in most of Australia, and we usually need the rain, although obviously not lately on the East Coast. We love summer, a time replete with ideals of beaches, holidays, and long celebratory evenings with friends and family. But as the climate changes, these embodied, place-based cultural practices that are oriented around affective pleasure are being disrupted. We loved summer. As writers, including SEI's own Danny Salamea, have observed, summertime is no longer what it was. The changing climate changes our affective experiences, our emotions, our physiological health, our understandings of the future, our sense of place. As my dear friend Mandy wrote during Australia's Black Summer, and this is a lengthy quote, "The season we're now experiencing is nothing like summers past. The blue sky has been replaced by mammoth clouds of smoke and ash, blocking the sun's rays. The ocean is scattered with the same ash and burnt, blackened leaves. Dead birds, feathers also blackened, wash up on the shore. Exploring nature is mostly out of the question as great swathes of the landscape have been annihilated or cut off, and the simple act of breathing is hazardous. The green aroma of cut grass has been replaced by the smell of unimaginable things burning, acrid and choking. And all the grass has died off anyway during the monotonous, relentless drought leading up to this planetary and humanitarian crisis right now at our doorstep. I feel crushed, depleted, dumbfounded, and so incredibly, inconsolably sad at the loss and trauma inflicted on so many living beings on this piece of earth we call home. Perhaps even sadder because my childhood summer holidays were spent on the south coast of New South Wales. Perhaps because just over a week ago I was there again, watching the sunrise in angry, brilliant colours through the smoke haze and swimming in an ash-littered ocean. Perhaps because my partner and I drove through beautiful, historic Cobargo less than 48 hours before a firestorm tore through the town and beyond, incinerating buildings, trees, animals, people. Perhaps because we stopped on a bush-fringed coastal road to let an echidna cross slowly, clumsily in front of us, and I now can't stop thinking that death by car would have been better, kinder, faster than the horrendous fate it may have since met. Perhaps because I know people who have lost their homes and others who anxiously await the next onslaught, unable to sleep as they anticipate a change in the wind or a stray ember. Perhaps because this isn't an abstract, distant prediction of a changing climate, its cataclysmic impacts, its unknowable ripple effects. This is our worst fears and most terrifying nightmares come to life. This is hell on earth, here and now. We knew it was coming, but we didn't stop it. From Mandy's writing, which you can find on our blog Firefields, we hear some of the complexity of the affective experience of climate catastrophe. It is pain in the lungs and itchy red eyes. It is being evacuated. It is heart-wrenching compassion for critters, fear for people, nostalgia for childhood memories, and anger at fossil capitalism. We often term this complex amalgamation of painful feelings and experiences climate anxiety or solastalgia, a word coined by Glenn Albrecht to refer to the melancholy and desolation we feel about environmental destruction. But this messy mix of feelings is not just loss, grief, and worry, but also anger, outrage, frustration, cynicism, and disgust about the injustice of climate change. Unlike the metaphors offered in the films Melancholia and Don't Look Up, where scientists have told us that a meteor is hurtling towards Earth and we're all doomed because we're unable to change it, climate distress is more complex and feels different to apolitical grief and worry because climate catastrophe could be prevented. Not everyone is doomed equally, and some people are actively and intentionally making it happen. As the always savvy David Schlosberg commented during the bushfire crisis, these disasters are not tragedies, they are injustices. And as my dear friend Jared Troutbeck says, it doesn't have to be this way. Feeling climate injustice then is replete with sensations of rage, abandonment, isolation and betrayal. In Australia, our former Prime Minister, literally flying from one settler colony to another to holiday in paradise while this nation burned, is an abhorrently apt representation of the distinct and unfair experiences of different people have of the climate crisis and why we're all so fucking angry. Climate injustice feels like disillusionment in democracy, being disrespected, losing all sense of karma and faith in humanity, helplessness, and being overwhelmed at our inability to have any meaningful personal impact, and internalised disgust at being unavoidably complicit. This mix of being complicit, vulnerable, ineffective, and disregarded is why what we call climate anxiety is such an existential crisis so disorienting, and so psychologically, culturally, socially, and politically harmful. This is why it's critical that we bring a careful political lens to the issue of climate feelings, because they are political and politicised. Consider this recent tweet, which suggests that climate scientists' social media communications are the cause of young people's extreme climate distress. Such sentiments are problematic for many reasons. Firstly, it is not the communication of the problem, but the problem itself that causes distress. Secondly, this logic is divisive and pitches two groups against each other, two groups that have in fact worked together and catalysed huge social change through their collaborations. It also ignores climate scientists' own needs to express themselves. Climate scientists are the original climate anxious group. They know what it feels like to be sifting through data that confirms your worst fears, searching for another explanation, to have to go through the peer review process hoping someone will tell you you're wrong, to have the media, public and government ignore, deride or even harass you, and to avoid discussing your work with your family as it's too hard to process or talk about. Of course, having a conversation about how we can communicate online to very diverse audiences about the severity of the issue and the need for urgent action without pushing some people who are already concerned over the edge is important. However, this logic that blames the messenger for young people's climate distress illuminates the ways in which climate emotions and our responses to them are politicised and manipulated by climate deniers. As a climate advocate who works with young people, my work is sometimes criticised as brainwashing or even child abuse by climate deniers. I've also heard this rhetoric from university management who suggests that I'm the reason that my students are upset about climate change. So let us not forget, the cause of climate anxiety is climate change, and climate change is caused by the combustion of fossil fuels and other forms of environmental destruction. Capitalism and colonialism are the root causes of this. A justice lens helps keep the focus on the unequal power relations that produce climate change and distress about it. In doing so, it can help us identify the ways in which the fossil economy seeks to sustain itself by dividing and conquering. One of the ways in which it does this is through what I term greenhouse gaslighting. Greenhouse gaslighting, apart from being a fun play on words, is a patriarchal practice that attempts to absolve climate criminals of responsibility through emotional manipulation and violence. Greenhouse gaslighting is perpetrated by both individuals and institutions, and we can see its logics and practices seep out into the broader social sphere, for example, in that tweet, and similar practices which seek to prevent people from engaging with, expressing, and responding to the very legitimate terror climate change elicits. I'm an Australian, and like many of you listening here tonight, have lived through the last couple of years' worth of climate catastrophes here in Australia. The Black Summer bushfires and more recently the terrifying floods. These disasters occurred during the Prime Ministership of Scott Morrison. As the leader of a climate-denying political party and the leader of the nation during those crises, Scott Morrison's actions, words, and his government's policies, or lack of them, are the best representation of greenhouse gaslighting that I know of. Of course, they're not the only ones, but they are for me personal, and that is part of it. So greenhouse gaslighting utilises the misogynistic practices of gaslighting, denying reality, dismissing someone's feelings and denigrating their subjective experience so as to gain control over understandings, narratives, processes and outcomes, and thus to gain power. Greenhouse gaslighting is the kind of climate denial that might accept that climate change is real and caused by fossil fuel combustion, but refuses to accept that it might be bad, or that the people who say they are adversely affected are right, or that they matter. This is evident in Scott Morrison telling young people that their climate anxiety is needless, and in him claiming that Australia is a great place to raise kids the day after images of Finn Burns, aged 11, in a gas mask in a tinny, piloting his family to safety from the ensuing inferno in Malakuta, went viral around the world. It is evident in his dismissal of the hostile reception he received from residents of Cobargo, one of the towns worst affected by the bushfires, who he stated were just feeling raw. Azina Armstrong and Peter Logue, other Cobargo locals, wrote in The Guardian at the time, "Having been through the nightmare of the past week, this is why we are angry and we think others may be. This disaster has been unfolding for several years. The request from 24 former fire chiefs to meet the Prime Minister in April could have been a turning point if that meeting had gone ahead and if the fire chief's fears had been taken seriously and acted upon. To dismiss these displays of anger as people feeling raw is to dismiss the depth of insight and understanding among those of us living through this crisis. Yes, we are feeling raw, and yes, we are grieving the losses. There was so much that could have been done ahead of time to help mitigate the extent of the destruction." Refusing to acknowledge that people may indeed be genuinely harmed by climate catastrophe amplifies the hurt. By downplaying the significance of their knowledge of their own lives, and through indicating that those people's suffering does not matter. By undermining the trustworthiness of people's anger, greenhouse gaslighting seeks to build consent for continued fossil fuel extraction through positioning such people as hysterics. Greenhouse gaslighting is a politics of disrespect and abandonment, of abrogation of responsibility. It blames people for their suffering that was largely, though perhaps not perfectly, preventable by governments, while making the situation worse and walking away from offering any tangible help. Or perhaps it pays lip service to suffering while avoiding any responsibility. We see this also in Scott Morrison's repeated reference to supporting our Pacific family, while doing everything possible to water down emissions reductions agreements around the world. In this image, Morrison poses for a photo opportunity with children in Tuvalu, who are sitting in water to represent the impending fate of their island homes and communities. While there for the Pacific Islands Forum, Morrison pushed for the agreement to remove reference to coal and the term climate crisis. Such climate violence is nevertheless couched in paternalistic rhetorics of protecting our vulnerable Pacific family, a kind of emotional manipulation reminiscent of perpetrators of domestic violence who excuse their actions under a pretense of care, love and protection for those they harm. So again, my apologies for such a lengthy discussion of Scott Morrison, but as you can see, he really is such an apt representative for this unfortunately widespread practice of emotional manipulation. To return to my original aim of thinking climate justice and climate feelings together, I suppose my argument is that affective climate justice can bring attention to this range of issues and hopefully inspire healthier, more democratic, anti-colonial practices of healing ourselves and each other together. Firstly, affective climate justice foregrounds issues of race, economics, gender, ability, and other categories of hierarchy within otherwise whitewashed discussions of climate anxiety. Not everyone feels the pain of climate crisis equally. Climate distress is not universal. It is not equally distributed around the world. Just as other climate justice research and advocacy has demonstrated, the impacts of climate change are unequal and tend to be experienced more severely by those who've contributed least to causing the problems. However, we do not really have the research to know what these injustices feel like for the communities who are most marginalised and affected. Of course, they know, but I cannot reliably or comprehensively share this with you. For this reason, affective climate justice is a research and advocacy agenda. We, and this we includes me, need to do better at foregrounding the emotional and felt experiences of diverse people around the world, and to do this in ways that contribute to their empowerment and agency, rather than positioning them as victims. Secondly, affective climate justice gets the burgeoning discussion on climate anxiety and disaster trauma out of an individualised, pathologised approach to explicitly situate them as systemic state violence. As part of this, it calls out greenhouse gaslighting for what it is, an attempt to manipulate society to continue consenting to the complete destruction of our only possible home through disrespecting and denying the lived realities of those who are forced to suffer for the at the expense of fossil fuel profits. Calling out greenhouse gas lighting also functions as a mode of witnessing people's experiences, of standing in solidarity, of validating their truths, and thus it is a practice of justice. Through asking about, listening to, and taking seriously people's experiences of rage, cynicism, disillusionment, and abandonment, we can hone in on the element of climate distress that is about feeling climate injustice specifically. Fortunately, communities all around the world are already doing this, and through their many ways of listening to each other and sharing their experiences, they connect and create solidarity through these mutual experiences of climate violence. Because although these experiences are always differentiated and unique for each person, according to their individual circumstances and place in society, they are nevertheless experiences which have considerable similarities. Affective climate violence harms people and seeks to divide us, but through the shared experiences of this oppression, collectives form in response. Outrage and anger are very effective at mobilising people. Critical to this happening, though, is making sure that that outrage and anger are made public so that others know that such feelings are shared. We see this in collective responses to Morrison's greenhouse gaslighting, which recently culminated in an incredible election loss for him. While elections are rarely attributable to one factor, and simple analyses of causality will mean we lose sight of what we need to pay attention to, community dissatisfaction with Morrison and his government's climate policy and disaster responses was electrically palpable and visible throughout so many parts of the country during the last election campaign. I'm not going to stand here and say that our new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and his government are not also flat out practising greenhouse gaslighting. Of course they are, it's just of a different flavour, one where the rhetoric is nice and the policy's a bit better, but this progress is used as justification for telling everyone to shut up and to stop asking for anything more. But my point is that over the last decade and culminating in the election campaign, community activists all across Australia have made careful, committed, continuing efforts to organise climate campaigning around listening to people and through resisting and rejecting the multiple forms of affective climate violence perpetuated by the extractivist settler state. These efforts include things such as political satire, like this street art here by Scott Marsh that calls out Morrison's efforts to use the deadly Lismore floods as a photo opportunity. Such efforts mobilise community sentiment against PR stunts like this and politicians' failure to take responsibility for anything. So this is the power of feeling climate injustice. Fairness is a deeply held value in many, if not all, societies. The scale of climate protests held in the last few years, especially those before the pandemic, which have been organised around climate justice, is testament to this. We know from lots of research that often being part of climate concern collectives that take action together creates empowering and healing affective experiences. Feeling climate justice feels like having a voice, being heard, being taken seriously, being cared about, having influence, making change and celebrating wins. It feels like being part of something bigger than yourself, of having integrity and of acting in line with your values. Taking action together feels good, although of course it is also a complex process and one that can lead to burnout. So, to wrap up, through situating climate distress as a political phenomenon, we can better analyse the emotional manipulation power holders enact to try to prevent climate action. We can do this by insisting that different people's different experiences of climate distress matter, and by ensuring that our theories of causality go to the root causes of the crisis, namely colonial, capitalist, patriarchal extractivism. Holding these root causes in mind means that while individual counselling for climate distress certainly has a place, we recognise that this can only ever be a partial cure rather than prevention. The real solution then is climate justice activism in diverse forms, in diverse places, with diverse people in their diverse ways. Any holistic response to climate distress, therefore, needs to be one that builds community and solidarity across and through diversity, one that recognises the deep and differentiated pain of climate catastrophe and which organises its activism in restorative, healing, regenerative ways that counteract rather than amplify the burnout and other psychic harm the climate crisis can inflict. I know that so much of this work is already happening, and also that people engaged in this work are here tonight in person and online. So I'll wrap up there so that we have time for discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Blanche. I just feel like we should just sit and absorb that for a while rather than pestering you with questions. So why don't we start with questions from the room while I check Slido and see if there's anything there. Folks at home, go ahead and pop stuff in Slido. But anyone want to kick us off? Anyone feeling brave or not so anxious to do so?
Firstly, thank you for that amazing presentation and for the work you do that is such hard work and that so many of us don't really want to focus on because it's so hard. So firstly, just want to recognise the work you're doing in all senses. And then to ask you, I heard somebody describing today Australians' relationship to climate activism and climate justice as kind of episodic, as coming and going, depending on what's happening in any given year in terms of the weather or particular events and so on. And I wonder, do you think that's true? And I wonder how you would think that in relation to the more enduring, more embodied mixture of conscious and unconscious kind of nature of affect.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I think it depends how you define activism a bit, I guess. Sarah Jaquette Ray writes about how our focus on the kind of really hyper-visible activism that, you know, is protests or big sort of showy things like that is, you know, a problematic understanding of what counts as activism, and that the sort of more quieter things around building relationships and, you know, self-reflection and meditation and self-care and community development and those kinds of things count just as much. And so I think if we take a broad view of activism, I wouldn't say that activism generally comes and goes, but for sure, you know, I think the climate movement will have strategic plans around when to do particular things, and also I think the nature of climate disasters is that they will elicit more spontaneous responses as well. So I think there's good strategic reasons for it appearing that way. And also people need to take breaks too. So, you know, there's reasons for kind of factoring in rest into a kind of calendar of the more visible stuff as well. Thanks, Ruth.
So I'm going to go to a Slido question, and I'm going to follow it up with my own as well, because you can be very helpful. What can we do to support diverse young people who have climate anxiety into careers and roles where they can have positive impacts and make a difference? And my add-on to this is I'm actually meeting with the GO8 sustainability heads tomorrow, and one of the key questions is, what should the GO8 do? What should the educational institutions do to help students into ways of responding to this kind of injustice that you're laying out?
Thank you. Thank you for the online question. I think one of the most important things is just to listen. You know, I think the experience of climate anxiety is changing as well, you know, because the climate crisis and how we understand it and represent it is also changing quite quickly. And so I think we need to be listening carefully, but young people, you know, they are the experts in what they find useful and valuable. And so listening carefully and then trying to work with young people, you know, to sort of find careers and jobs and opportunities for them that meets what they want to create is really critical to that. Was that all? Did I answer all of it? Okay. I might have forgot the second bit. Tamara.
That was amazing. Thank you. It was so good to go on that journey with you. And yes, thank you for doing this work that is deep work. I think I have a really similar question, but maybe just just even more practical. So I'm teaching an environmental activism course. I just came from that to come here, and some other similar courses at UNSW. And I guess I'm wondering, in your experience in front of a classroom, talking about these things, what have you seen, besides listening, is most helpful, supportive, transformative for students?
Thanks, Toma. So the follow-up, like, what else?
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I am a big fan of listening, but I think it's really important that, like, to me, the thing that I have seen to be the most transformative, and it's kind of counterintuitive, is for people to see that other people are upset like them. So, you know, I think we get really caught up in the, like, really political, heated discussions about how important hope is, and whatever the right way is to kind of get people to feel hopeful. But in my experience, what I've seen is that for people who are feeling really distressed, for someone else to tell them that they should feel hopeful and that these are the reasons for hope actually just says to them, I'm not listening to you. And so for them to hear from other people that they feel similarly, and that they're not alone in their experience is really important, because through the knowledge that other people are equally concerned, have similar experiences, that, you know, it's how we connect and form collectives and build solidarity. And that is where the hope comes from, is through knowing that you're not alone, through being part of a community who can take action. And so, yeah, kind of counterintuitively giving people space to safely express their fears and worries is what I've found to be most transformative. But obviously there's, you know, a lot of care that needs to go into making that possible for people.
So this is a related question from Slido. First, greetings from Emociones Climáticas from Latin America. So you're being heard.
I love them.
How do we advocate for emotions and affections within a public conversation which avoids them? Right, so taking that listening, but putting it into practice.
Thank you. Hogging the microphone. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it is really difficult because, you know, especially in societies where emotion has been strategically positioned as something that's feminized and therefore, you know, seen as irrational and devalued and not important, it can be really hard to disrupt those logics and to be able to make a case for why emotions are, you know, central to people's lived experience and really important, but also that they're insightful and intellectual, and help us actually learn and come up with what are useful solutions. So I think that's kind of an explanation of why your question is a good one. But in terms of what we can do, I think the more that we try to talk about it in lots of spaces, the more that conversation is becoming acceptable in a broader range of spaces. And, you know, not that researchers necessarily have more value in these spaces, but in the conversations, but some people are swayed by statistics, you know, working out what the logics are that speak to particular people, you know, finding their modes of communication and then bringing that kind of mechanism of communication to the topic, I guess, would be my advice.
Maybe one more, Susan?
Thank you, Blanche. That was fantastic. So I haven't really thought about this much, and you probably have, but how does climate denialism, is that a form of climate anxiety, and where does affect fit?
Yeah, I think everyone's anxious about climate change, but just about different elements of it. So I think climate deniers are anxious about losing power if people accept that climate change is real and then demand more of them or vote them out or those sorts of things. So it is a form of climate anxiety. It's just not the one that we usually position under that umbrella. But I think the more we can recognise that so many people are driven intensely by their emotional experiences, and, you know, I don't think that it's like that those climate deniers in positions of power deserve us giving them space to sort of say, oh, how are you feeling? Why are you so anxious? Like, how could we support you? But sometimes I think, like, I don't know how we actually do that, but I think the more people have the capacity to reflect on how their actions are informed by, you know, our human experiences of insecurity and wanting to feel like we belong in society and these kind of base needs, I think, you know, trying to find the common ground can come from that. But, you know, yeah.
And I just want to end by reading what is not a question but a comment, but a good one. I just want to thank you for inspiring me to pursue climate action when I was one of your students at RMIT in the mid-2010s. So they're sticking with you. This is great. We are unfortunately out of time, both for this talk and for your time with us, which is really devastating to us as a whole. So look, I just want to thank you again for your time with us, for this incredible talk, for bringing together a group like this, and I don't know how many online. I do want the group here and also online to know we are currently advertising for 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one in adaptation and one in Indigenous environmental studies. So come along and be the next Blanche, and then you too can be giving a talk like this in 3 years' time. Thanks again to Blanche. Thanks to Evie Wright, our amazing event coordinator, for running all of this. Thanks to Nat for the live streaming and the recording. I want to thank the whole SEI team. Thanks, Blanche, for all of the work. Thanks to the audience for the questions and for joining us. Everybody can sign up for our newsletter, hear about more events like this, our monthly seminars and more. For those of you in the room, join us outside for drinks and nibbles. For those at home, just toast the absolutely fantastic and important work of Blanche in her time here with us at SEI. Thanks, everyone, very much.